David Gran, the author of the book that Killers of the Flower Moon is based on, once said in an interview that as he was researching the Reign of Terror, a string of murders committed against the Osage tribe in the 1920s, that what originally seemed like a whodunit quickly became more of a who didn't do it, as there were so many white people, criminals, and supposed friends of the Osage who were at best complicit and at worst the ones orchestrating the murders of potentially more than 60 Osage from 1921 to 1926, when the Osage were the richest people per capita on the entire planet. It's a criminally underdiscussed stain on our history as Americans, and a harrowing example of the pure evil that can stem from capitalistic greed and insidious systems of racism and oppression. And it's a story being told by none other than Martin Scorsese, and has the likes of Leonardo DiCaprio, Lily Gladstone, and Robert De Niro starring. So I obviously thought it was a masterpiece, right? That's what you're gonna hear a lot, is that this film is a masterpiece. And we all know how we feel when we watch a movie that we think is a masterpiece. And though I liked this film a lot, I didn't quite get there with it, and I was hoping that I would. And it's been a difficult one to nail down exactly why. It has a lot to do with it as an adaptation and a historical epic. Huge disclaimer, this is a spoiler-free review, but going forward, I'm gonna be discussing who the quote-unquote villain is of this story. But in the film, it is very obvious from the get-go. It is not something I would consider a spoiler. I've also had that confirmed by some of my fellow critics who are going to be talking about it in their reviews. But if you truly want to go in blind to this film, you don't know anything about the history of the Osage, just come back after you've seen it, but you've been warned. So let's talk about it. But first, let me know what you guys think of Killers of the Flower Moon. Have you read the book? Are you going to make the trip to theaters to see it despite the runtime? And maybe that's the best place to start. The elephant in the room, because there's been a lot of fun and not at all dreadful discourse about the fact that this film is 3.5 hours long. And I can safely say that if anyone tells you that you can't feel a minute of the runtime, they're lying. You can tell when you're watching a 3.5 hour movie. Our bodies have an internal clock, and though I didn't feel like, oh my god, every single frame of this was absolutely necessary, that is not a complaint at all, because man, this movie is really well paced, like impressively well paced. I wasn't ready for it to be over. I wasn't bored. I mean, people have been talking about this like it's gonna be some chore, like Scorsese isn't one of the most entertaining filmmakers who ever lived. And especially in light of his recent comments about getting older and only having so much time left to tell stories, I want him to make his movies as long as his adorable little heart desires. It really balances the graveness of this story and keeping you engaged with his classic long takes of the bustling main street and interesting editing. It's very successful in transporting you to this time period and fully realizing the dynamic that was alive in Osage County, kind of this subversion where the Osage are extremely wealthy and the white people are the street peddlers and trying to gain proximity to their wealth by marrying or befriending them. And yet, there was still oppression and dehumanization occurring, especially in how the Osage weren't even allowed to be in charge of their own finances. They had to have white guardians, and it did not get any easier having to see Lily Gladstone as Molly go and try to do something with her money and have to declare herself as incompetent. And in true Oppenheimer fashion, it turns into a bit of a courtroom drama in the third act with a bunch of late-stage cameos, because Jesse Plemons' character, Tom White, shows up with what would go on to become the FBI. This case was actually a huge catalyst in the creation of the FBI. And so him showing up, which actually happens way later in the film than I thought it was going to, is kind of this change in direction as action is finally being taken against what's happening to the Osage, because they were failed catastrophically by local government and law enforcement for so long. So, that's not any sort of compliment for the FBI being a day late and a dollar short. But I've seen some people complain about the final third of this. I actually found that part maybe the most consistently engaging. But on the whole, I am pro intermission, just for the record. But on the whole, the runtime is really not something to worry about. But let's backtrack for a second, because I gave some detail about the story, but in this film, we're following Ernest Burkhart and Molly Burkhart as Ernest returns from being a cook in World War I. They fall in love, but as Molly's family slowly begins to be targeted for their head rights, she might not be able to trust her husband and his manipulative uncle as much as she thought. Even in probably one of the best filmographies of all time, I genuinely think this is at least a top 5 Leonardo DiCaprio performance, and I don't really use statements like that. And I always see, it's always Leo or it's like Joaquin Phoenix or like best performance of his career. But I actually really did think this performance was amazing. And Lily freaking Gladstone is every part his equal. I loved her as Molly Burkhart. A lot of people have been talking about the fact that she switched from supporting actress to lead actress, but I don't know. I thought she was more than good enough here to get a lead actress nomination. Just so many amazing subtleties, because this is a very understated performance. There's a lot of yearning from Lily Gladstone, and yet Molly remains stoic and thoughtful. Sometimes she's hiding a smile, or she seems like quietly suspicious, but there's also this explosive pain that she experiences. Molly Burkhart went through, like, hell is too nice of a term. Like, more loss in such a short time than anyone should ever experience. And it's horrific. There are some gruesome and just really sad images of the victims of the Reign of Terror. And there are a couple instances where both Lily Gladstone and Leonardo DiCaprio get to show just that spirit-crushing wailing in the face of grief. Robert De Niro is good. I don't know. He's doing his gangster thing. I didn't feel super passionately about his performance, but he's Robert fucking De Niro. I don't know. He was great. He was really good as this slick, like, wolf in sheep's clothing. And he learned a lot of Osage for this, and he sounded really good using it. I would say that any of my hesitations about this film can kind of be tied to how it was adapted. Their original script idea was going with a very similar structure to the book. David Grann's book is strictly nonfiction, and he uses the investigation to frame the whole thing. We find out information as Tom White did. And there have been a lot of articles actually going around right now about how they scrapped the screenplay for this film 2 years into the writing process because Leonardo DiCaprio read it. He was actually supposed to play Jesse Plemons' character, Tom White, the FBI investigator, but he said, what is the heart of this film? And they decided that the heart of the film is not only with Molly Burkhart, but is kind of with Molly and Ernest's relationship and their dynamic. And so they wanted to pivot to that and tell it more from an Osage perspective. And though I understand why they pivoted the way they're telling the story, I actually think that it created a bit of a perspective issue, not in the way that there is no perspective, but that it gets stuck in between a few different perspectives it's trying to cater to. It is no longer using the FBI investigation as our vantage point, and it does focus more on Molly. But make no mistake, guys, Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart is the main character of this film, if there had to be one. And that's not extremely surprising, as Scorsese is throwing what he knows. He's very good at exploring evil white men, and William Hale and Ernest Burkhart were perhaps the evilest of white men. He takes a lot of time looking at their power dynamic and how Ernest is, for lack of a better word, a complete dunce and very impressionable. And yes, he gets kind of swindled and pressured into this by his uncle, but it's also made very clear that he likes what he likes, and he likes women, and he likes money, and he knew exactly what he was doing. And there is also a lot of emphasis on Ernest and Molly's toxic romance, and I found that part really well done, very palpable. But I think in terms of emotional grip, it tries to let you in on too many things, so it dilutes the really important ones just a little bit. I wish there was just a bit more time dedicated to these Osage characters, seeing Molly interact with her sisters. I felt that these things happened in fleeting moments more than they felt like something that you were really immersed in. And one of the most devastating things about this story, besides the obvious, is the moment where Molly truly comes to terms with what has been going on after fighting so hard to see the good in people and to really trust people. The moment happens, but you don't really get to see Molly experience that moment, and that was a little bit disappointing for me. And the book does lean way harder into these kind of reveals. Probably just as big of a change from the book is that it is obvious that William Hale is orchestrating this from the get-go, whereas in the book it was kind of this slow burn. But we had a really great discussion on the podcast. We did a spoiler-filled episode that'll be out the Tuesday after the film's release. But we talked about how not having that reveal was most likely an effort by Scorsese to not sensationalize these events. He pulls from his crime flick toolbox, but it's not being dramatized beyond what's necessary. It's not treading into the fantastical. It's very sparingly humorous. I think he is very intentionally avoiding this big cinematic gotcha moment and reveal, which is something that he actually does quite often in his films. And I guess I have some mixed feelings about that. I think as a result, he feels a tiny bit restrained, but it's also out of respect and out of this effort to bring it all back to the importance of this story and what happened to the Osage. And on that note, I think the last line of this movie is far and away the most powerful in the entire thing and one of the best endings in recent memory for me. It brings the core belief and purpose of the film full circle. This film is about stories and power, and it's about the Osage reclaiming their history and not letting the atrocities committed by white men define them or have power over them. It's very moving. The final sequence is just incredibly clever. It's spectacularly edited by Thelma Schoonmaker. Some people might think it's gimmicky, I don't know, but I liked it a lot. It's all a double-edged sword because ideally an Osage filmmaker would be able to tell this story and have this budget to do it and get this many people to pay attention, but that's just not always the reality. And so it can both be true that this is not entirely Martin Scorsese's story to tell and that he told it in the best way that he could, and it's getting the exposure that it deserves in that way. And it's good at least that it was Scorsese who took such immense care in not only getting it right, but being heavily reliant on Osage people who were helping him do that and were even involved in many aspects of the film, like the script and costume design. A really incredible poster was just released that is way better than whatever the heck this is, that has artwork by Addie Rowenhorst, the film's Osage Nation ambassador. I'm also going to link a couple reviews and articles with feedback from an Indigenous critic, Vincent Schilling, who I actually met at my screening of this. Very, very nice guy, and he wrote a really great review of this film. And some of the feedback, there's like an article with some feedback from the Osage people who were involved with the film. It's really interesting to hear their perspectives on it, and I'm very glad that they felt comfortable and that they were honest, speaking up about some of the criticisms that they had of the film. So overall, Killers of the Flower Moon, of course, has the touch of maybe our greatest living filmmaker, and it's filled with career best performances, breathtaking technical filmmaking, and just really powerfully tells a story that needs to be told. I had more reservations about it than I was hoping for because the ideal number was 0, but I still really, really enjoyed this film. I think people are going to absolutely love it. I'm going to give Killers of the Flower Moon 4 out of 5 stars. This is a film that is impossible to thoroughly get right reviewing after just one watch, so I'm determined to see it again. Maybe I'll have an Oppenheimer moment and my rating will go up. Maybe I will settle into some of these issues and my rating will go down. I think Oppenheimer is better than this, actually. I'm curious to know other people's thoughts about that. I highly encourage everyone to get out and see this in theaters, or at least read the book, because this is essential American history. It feels weird to watch a movie that I know my hypothetical kids are going to be watching in class and probably will dread watching because their brains aren't fully developed yet. And the runtime really is a non-issue, guys. No one in my screening got up a single time, and I didn't even have to pee after it was over, and I was playing with fire and drinking a bottle of Dasani the entire time. There's only a day or two left until people everywhere will be able to see this, and I cannot wait to hear everyone's thoughts on it. We've got so many more exciting films coming up soon for the rest of the year, like Poor Things, Silent Night, Priscilla, The Killer. So make sure to like and subscribe and keep an eye out for more videos soon. Thanks for watching.